Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was May 23rd, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Molt Cara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Well, before we get started with today's document, and actually we have two documents for today, I just want to take a moment to say welcome to episode 150. Wow, that's a lot of episodes. And quite honestly, I was worried that I would not be able to keep up and get to this point, and I'm happy to say that it's going strong. It has been difficult to keep up at some points, especially certain very busy moments of that academic calendar towards the end of the semester, for example, but it's been really fun. I look forward to doing these episodes. I always have to cut off the amount of time I'm able to devote to them, and that's always dissatisfying, as the motto of the podcast applies. So it's been a joy to be able to do this, and I feel that I am going strong and that I'm going to do another 150, and then after that, another 65. We're not even halfway done. It feels like it's been so much, but, you can just track it by how far into the year we are, with the little exception of the fact that in 1387, day one of the year was December 25th. So, yeah, 150 episodes. I'm feeling really great about that, and feel like I'm learning a lot as I go about the operation of the Chancery, about Joan and Violant, about medieval history, and that really this whole experience is a really good demonstration of what it takes to think through documents from so long ago, but also just any historical document. So the whole point of the podcast is to take people into a certain stage of the research process that often is erased when the final product emerges in publication. So whether we're talking about a monograph, a book with a bunch of footnotes, or whether we're talking about an article in an academic journal, the initial stages of collecting the archival evidence, that often falls away because the historian has to pick and choose which documents they're going to discuss, which they're going to focus on. There's been so much content produced just by the short episodes that I've been doing daily that you can understand by this point how if I were to try to address every single document that I've found, it would be too unwieldy and too long. And so choices are required when the historian moves from the initial gathering of evidence into the construction of a historical narrative or a historical argument. And the boundaries between narrative and argument are really interesting when it comes to history, and that gets super philosophical, which I could go on about, but we gotta set our boundaries here so that this particular episode today doesn't turn into an hour and a half of me talking about the philosophy of history and historiography, which I could easily do. So in any event, notice how when a historian is trying to figure out their argument or the way that they're going to construct a narrative of what happened in the past, they're confronted with the difficulties of all this material. And when we're looking at material from the 14th century, there's the language barrier, there's the fact that some stuff survived and other stuff did not. There's the fact that these documents are not neutral records, that they are written for a very, very distinct purpose. I mean, we're going to talk today again about the purpose of portraying Joan as in good health, even when he might not be. We know that that is an urgent purpose for Violant and Joan himself and all of the members of the government. And so we're seeing the product of, you could say, a certain kind of political spin or an agenda, that every document is like that, not just ones that are coming out of a royal chancery in the 14th century, but all written record is like that. Things are written down for a reason. Things are omitted from the written record for a reason. And so when a historian is confronted with just a gigantic mass of material that has all been produced with all of these omissions and spin and agenda, you could use the word bias, although that's a very problematic word in my mind. When a historian is confronted with the material that's been generated from that in a mass quantity, trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do with this as I first encounter it in terms of integrating it into my overall understanding? And then at the second stage, deciding, well, am I going to move forward with this as part of my narrative or argument? That is a gigantic amount of cognitive work. And it usually gets erased when you're looking at the final product of a journal article or a book of history. The decision making, the wondering, the guesswork, the initial hypothesizing, all of that is not recorded in the final product, with a few exceptions. Sometimes in the footnotes you'll see a little bit of this. Other times you'll have a historian who decides to be extremely self-reflective in the product that they create. So that does happen. And I would say, for an example of that, you should definitely look at the book Silencing the Past by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot. And then I have another one that really comes to mind about this, a book by Zeb Tortorici about early modern colonial Spain, so talking about what is today Mexico, and it's called Sins Against Nature, and it's all about sexuality in that particular time and place, but it's a work that does an excellent job of bringing to the forefront a lot of the thinking about the practice of being a historian. So those are two works that, just off the top, there's so many others actually. There are actually a lot of historians that like to be very self-reflective and actually bring the reader into the metacognition piece of doing history. So I shouldn't say that you can't find it at all. It's just that most published historical works do not have that. And even if they do, if they were to bring into visibility the whole process, like what I'm doing here, the book would balloon to be over 1,000 pages long. So my point stands that this whole enterprise, this whole podcast, it's very experimental in its style. it is meant to reveal something that, unless you are really inside academic research of history, you're not really going to see. So thanks for this experience. If you're listening to all this, if you've listened to a whole bunch of episodes, I hope that you're getting that goal achieved in terms of being able to be alongside me as I look at these documents and to get into a part of how history gets made that I think not many people get to see. And so that's hopefully the goal being achieved here. And it's all about being okay with uncertainty and making guesses and actually being wrong a whole lot of the time. All right, so speaking of making guesses and being wrong, I have done some additional reading about the marriage negotiations between Violant and Joan on the one hand, and on the other, Marie de Blois, the mother of Louis II of Anjou. And I had, when discussing these marriage negotiations, said some stuff like, oh yeah, it takes all the way into 1388. Well, folks, I just did some additional reading about this, actually a little bit of rereading of something I had encountered a couple years ago, and I realized, I am wrong about that. It takes longer. So the book that is super helpful about these marriage negotiations is one by a fantastic historian, super friendly person, Zita Eva Rohr. Zita Rohr researches Yolande of Aragon. That is how Joan and Violant's daughter is remembered in history. She probably would have been called Violant, like Violant Jr. in a way, but in order to reduce the amount of confusion, historians have settled on calling Joan's wife Violant de Bar and Joan's daughter Yolande of Aragon. So yes, Yolande of Aragon does end up marrying Louis II of Anjou. But the pathway to getting to that marriage is super complicated, and Zita Rohr does an excellent job of explaining that in her book from 2016, Yolande of Aragon, Family and Power, The Reverse of the Tapestry. So Zita Rohr has a metaphor of the tapestry and then what you see on the reverse side, all the strings and knots and stuff. It's cool metaphor for representation of the life of a historical figure. And the book itself is a really great read with lots of awesome dramatic narration of historical events and just a great amount of style. So I think that reading that book is a really fun way to get into the story of Joan and Violant and also the history of their daughter. So at the time when we are focusing on the documents we're looking at, 1387, the first year of the reign of Joan and Violant, their daughter, Yolande of Aragon, is 6 years old, and the person they are trying to get her married to is 10 years old. Now, they're not trying to have the marriage happen like right away. It's seen as this long process that they'll get down on paper, and then the actual wedding will take place years later. What I learned from Zita Rohr is that this marriage negotiation was bonkers. Like, there was all kinds of weird, like, passive aggressiveness. There was a kind of, like, sort of, we're going to pretend that we're not interested anymore. At one point, Joanne and Violant are thinking that instead of marrying Yolanda to Louis II of Anjou, they're going to have her marry Richard II of England, which is like crazy because this is the time of the 100 Years' War, and Violant would have really thought of the English as like the arch enemy. So the fact that she's like seriously considering that is like saying something. And maybe that was just a tactic to get a better deal from the French royal family. Because another piece of this that I hadn't quite appreciated was that the father of Louis II of Anjou was a son of the French king Jean II. So this would mean that Louis II's father was another one of Violant's uncles. So Jean II had a bunch of boys, and so there's all of these guys who are these dukes that are this kind of generation of power in the French royal family. So there was the King Charles V. Then the brothers were the Duc de Berry and the Duke of Burgundy, who are like the regents, while Charles VI is young. But then there's also Louis I, the Duke of Anjou. And so basically there's this set of princes, these dukes, that are incredibly powerful and do a lot to promote the interests of France and do a lot in terms of the management of military campaigns and finances and so on. And so Louis I, the Duke of Anjou, is trying to get control of Naples, and he's struggling to do that against these Italian-Hungarian folks, the Durazos. Oh, it's just so complicated. But just one thing to keep in mind is that Louis I of Anjou was the chosen heir of Joanna of Naples. So Joanna of Naples has come up on the podcast a bunch of times. She really reminds me of Violant de Bar, but of like an earlier generation. And Joanna of Naples rules Naples in her own right, and she's a very dramatic person, possibly killed her husband. So basically, and she shows up and is in Avignon negotiating, and at one point she actually saved anti-Pope Clement VII, and so they're kind of buddy-buddy. So anyway, it's all very, just this very tangled web of alliances and enmities and antagonisms. Oh my gosh. But all of this is to say that when Violant is negotiating this marriage, she's involved in bringing her daughter back into this very powerful center in the French royal family. It's not some kind of weird offshoot. It's very much connected in to the French royal family as an institution. So the negotiations are, I think, ones that have a lot of stakes attached, high stakes negotiations. The other thing that I've mentioned before on the podcast and is important to keep in mind about these marriage negotiations is that they are kind of the equivalent of like big trade deals in our time. So two countries will work for a really, really long time on hammering out these very gigantic deals that have a lot of various points in them, topics, different articles inside them, and there will be this long drawn out negotiation, and then in the end, they make the deal. That's, I think, a good analogy to the scope and the stakes for marriage negotiations in the Middle Ages, especially this time of the late Middle Ages that we're looking at here. Now, I haven't even gotten to what the document is for today. The document is super interesting because it is a letter from Violant to Louis II of Anjou directly, the future husband of her daughter. And he's 10 years old. And then you have another letter right after that to Marie de Blois, the father of Louis II. And she's at this time a widow and acting as a regent for Louis II, even though he doesn't actually have control over Naples, so they're not literally governing anything. It's all in title, but it's a seriously considered title. It's seen as legitimate by everybody in Avignon and everybody in France. It's just they haven't conquered it back yet. They haven't conquered Naples back from the Durazzo side of things. I'm not even sure if it's the Durazzos that are in control of Naples right now. It might be. But anyway, someone else has it. It could be the Hungarians. I don't know. But right now, they don't have it. And what they're really after here is, one, legitimacy for holding Naples once they conquer it. And two, they're after funding and resources to carry out the conquering. So the first part, the legitimacy, has to do with how Sicily was part of the Crown of Aragon. And so if you've got Sicily, if you've got a claim to Sicily through the daughter of the King of the Crown of Aragon, then that helps to kind of unify the territory once you get back into control of Naples. And then the other piece, the money, is, well, the marriage negotiation comes with a dowry. And so they're looking to get, and part of it too, which I learned from reading this first chapter of Zita Rohr's book, is that part of what's in these betrothal negotiations is that the Crown of Aragon will send France 10 warships. My goodness. So it's like literally the stuff that the material that they're gonna use to conquer Naples. Okay, so that is, again, a digression about this whole larger background to this marriage. In the moment, in 1387, we have these two documents. One is written to Louis II, age 10, and the other is written to his mother, Marie de Blois. And they're basically the same. They're the same content. It's just pleasantries, but it's saying we've received your messengers and we're gonna send replies through our messengers. So it's very vague. It doesn't really give you any sense of what the sticking points are in the negotiations. I honestly, at this point, after reading the chapter by Zita Rohr, I am not sure whether Violant was interested in having this come to a quick conclusion. Or maybe at some times she was, and other times she saw the advantage to dragging it out. So basically, Luigino Scarampi is in Avignon trying to manage the negotiations. They're also getting ambassadors, messengers from Naples showing up in Barcelona and telling them things. And so this is just, is this disorganized? Is this like a big mess? Are there people going back and forth all the time in a way where there's contradictory information and a real question about who's actually in charge of running these negotiations? Or is it actually proceeding according to a pretty set script of how this is supposed to go? Are there supposed to be these multiple lines of communication where you use them like playing different strings on an instrument in order to maximize your outcome in the final deal? I don't know. I'm kind of leaning towards the latter. I think Violant knows what she's doing, and that this is a very complex dance that is being done in order to create this big deal, this big agreement between these political entities. So we have this letter directly from the Queen of the Crown of Aragon, the mother of the bride, to the former Duchess of Anjou, current regent of Naples, mother of the groom, as well as a letter to the future groom himself, who's at age 10 at this time. So is he even like really reading this, thinking about this? I don't know. But all that it amounts to is a bunch of pleasantries. There's nothing that you can look at in this letter, I think, and say that we're learning anything new in any detail. The one thing that I will definitely point out in this is that in both letters, we have our old, dependable statement about Joan. Dit signor es en bona convalescencia. So he's in good convalescence. He's getting better. And the word that Violant uses here to describe his illness is simply mal, M-A-L. So the whole phrase is Dit signor es en bona convalescencia de son mal. All right, so here we have another instance in which Violant is saying Joan is recovering from his illness. He's on his way to feeling really great. After that phrase, we have in the first letter, Així que esperam que serva guarit en breu. That was sera, not serva. So then she says, we hope that soon he's going to be all better. And then she goes on to say that everybody else, all the children and herself, they're all in good health. So basically, we're returning to the kind of stuff that we were seeing before April 28th. And yeah, how much can we believe this? It's an open question. It's an open question because certainly if Joan were to die, this whole marriage negotiation thing would probably be abandoned. So it's in Violant's interest, absolutely, to create the impression for Marie de Blois, especially, that Joan is going to be just fine and that this long, complex process of negotiation for this marriage should continue. Do not abandon it. And guess what? Marie de Blois is not 100% invested in this. She is looking at other options. And at certain points in the multi-year process that basically goes from like 1387 all the way up until 1392, Marie de Blois is not sure whether this is what she wants to do. And so this is from both directions. It's kind of like an iffy process. The actual deal gets done in 1392. 1392, 5 years it takes to seal this deal. And there's like different negotiation positions all the way, and different bluffs, and different kind of, I'm walking away from this threats, or like I'll sweeten the deal in this way, enticements, back and forth, all the way until 1392. then the actual marriage doesn't take place until the year 1400. So it's to their credit that they kept the deal from 1392 all the way until 1400, especially since at one point Yolanda of Aragon says to her parents, I'm not doing it. I didn't agree to this when I had any awareness of what I was agreeing to. So she almost walks away. So it's all very dramatic. All right. What else? Oh, I did want to mention there's this cool moment that Zitoror has from the bottom of page 17 to the top of page 18 in her book, in which Louis the Second's chancellor, I think it was Louis the First chancellor, Lefebvre, writes that Joanne's offer was paltry and his demands were excessive. So I think that was like later, like in 1388. But basically, from the Crown of Aragon side, we've already seen a document saying that this was going to be the largest dowry that any Crown of Aragon bride had ever had. So I'm not quite sure where that's coming from. But it just goes to show how there was all this back and forth and wasn't clear, who was really offering the real terms. And it was a real bargaining situation here. Business negotiation. Huh. All right. Well, we learned a little bit about medieval marriage negotiations and got deeper into the facts about the marriage between Yolanda of Aragon and Louis II of Anjou. So, yeah, I was wrong about my stuff earlier when I was saying that it was done by 1388. Nope, not at all. Okay, thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.